Hello,
Hello. Today we're going to talk about systemic functional grammar model. I'm Mariano Chacana and I'm with.
I'm Agostina Alessandro. Okay, to start with, within this topic, we have four different models: structural, transformational, systemic, and case grammar. Okay, I'm going to start with the topic structural or taxonomic model. Okay, to start with, it is relevant to mention that the term taxonomy refers to the process of naming and classifying different topics, such as animal, or in this case, grammatical constructions, into groups within a larger system according to their similarities and differences. Okay, the analytic technique developed by the structuralists Harris and Bloomfield is recognized as immediate constituents analysis, and they refer that any grammatical construction which is not simple can be reduced to a pair of constituents, or in other words, the construction, in this case, powerful, is analyzed into power plus full, or as a formula composed by three parts, AB plus C. While the simply identical word as unpowerful reduces to un plus powerful or A plus BC. Okay, we can also apply the taxonomic model in larger constructions such as pretty little cat evaluates as pretty plus little cat or A plus BC, or another arrangement that has two immediate constituents such as very little plus cat or AB plus C. Okay, in the case of a sentence, we can analyze John is the nicest boy who speaks French. Okay, in this case, we've got two immediate constituents, the main clause and the dependent clause. The first breakdown into the subject, which is John, and the predicate is nicest boy. And on the other hand, the dependent clause is conformed by the subject who and the predicate speaks French. Now, in an almost identical manner, we are going to analyze each predicate into the verb and the complement, taking into account the complement object of the main clause, the nicest boy. And to conclude, nicest boy has the two immediate constituents, nicest and boy. Okay, the horizontal line demarks a construction, while each vertical line indicates the two immediate constituents. In this analysis, no reference is made to the meaning of the construction or of the putative immediate constituents, some of which are constructions in their own right, and the whole process of analysis depends on the notion of distribution. Then we got another sentence. In this case, she bought a pretty X last month. In this case, the X is not specified, but according to the construction, a determinate A and an adjective pretty results easy to anticipate that we are talking about a noun. We don't know of which noun, but a list can be proposed, for example, present, quote. The principle of symptomatic and paradigmatic determination of linguistic choices is exploited in Language 2, teaching through the substitution table. The structuralist model makes use of the four categories of language, which are unit, structure, class, and system. Thus, the noun phrase is composed with a determinate plus an adjective plus a noun. Given the incomplete, for example, determinate plus an adjective, we know that it will be completed by the insertion into the slot of a class of words called noun. These categories lend themselves well to interlingual comparison, and there are also some weaknesses in the model where we can find ambiguity and the difference between a restrictive relative clause and a non-restrictive clause. Okay, we can say that identity of position or distribution is not a guarantee of identity of function, and the observation that we realize on the basis of relative positions in the structure refers to the surface structure. Observations concerning the functional relations between constituents refers to a deep structure. Uh, The author Fries defines grammar as the devices of form and arrangement, and in this case, arrangement means to the relative order of elements in constructions, formal devices operating at the level of grammar. There are three different kinds. We've got morphological markers, function words as articles, and suprasegmentals, which are the devices of stress and intonation. Okay, usually languages show preferences for the use of some formal devices rather than others, and exists a distinction between the analytic and synthetic language types. For example, the language Turkish is a case of an agglutinating language. Some languages make extensive use of the pitch suprasegmental, such Chinese, Thai, which are considered tone languages. If we talk about a pair of languages, it is possible to find cases in which the first language carries a certain meaning by one device, while the second language conveys the same meaning by another device. In English, direct object nouns are differentiated from the indirect object by the later coming before the former. So the structure is composed by a subject plus a verb plus an indirect object and finally plus a direct object. Okay, if we compare Spanish and English, we can say that Spanish has no marker of third person singular on the verb, while English does. For example, the verb come in Spanish and eats in English. However, Spanish marks the verb of the third person plural while English does not. For example, the article las, and in English the universal article de or the, depending the context. Here we have a case of same medium in terms of morphology and partially same items, but these are items being differently distributed.
Well, the first model that I'm considering here is transformational generative grammar. About this model, we can say that this model was elaborated by Chomsky, and it recognizes a level of deep structure and a level of surface structure, which are related by sets of transformations. About the term generative, we can say that it is understood by two senses, that is projective and explicit. And projective refers to not only actual sentence, but also potential sentences. What is more, the grammar not only decides whether a given combination is grammatically or not, but also it provides a structural description. And about the explicit, we can say that it is explicit because it says which sentences are possible in a language by specifying them. About the reasons that we can use transformational generative grammar. One of them is explicitness, because for each step in deriving surface structure from deep structure, an explicit rule must be formulated. Um, Another reason that we are considering here is that transformational generative grammar is attractive to contrast analysis because it has been claimed that deep sentences are universal or common to all languages. The sentence, the transformation, sorry, apply to deep structures and are taken from a universal stock, which is called formal universal. In passing from deep structure to surface structure, we have three transformations that are involved. One of them is relativization, WH, relative deletion, and adjective shifting. For instance, an example of this, we can say we have the sentence, I have a car, plus the car is blue. An example of relativization, we can say something like, I have a car which is blue, using the relative clause, which is in this case which. An example, using this pattern, we can use the same sentence and say, I have a car blue. In this case, we are omitting the relative clause. About adjective shifting, we can say, I have a blue car, in shifting both adjectives. But the thing is now that when we are passing to Spanish, we can use the three transformations because we have the sentence tengo un auto más el auto es azul. One example of relativization could be tengo un auto que es azul. One example of WH relative deletion, we can say tengo un auto azul, omitiendo el que en este caso. But the thing is that adjective shifting is not possible in Spanish because it would sound ungrammatical. We cannot say something like tengo un azul auto. It's not possible. Well, the reason for using this approach in contrastive analysis is that provides for the two languages identical means to explain in an explicit way grammatical ambiguities. Attribute adjectives can be ambiguous, and the ambiguous is accounted for deriving from a deep structure with a relative clause. For example, the productive Japanese. In this case, it is implied that the Japanese who are productive. Another reason we can say that generative grammar provides a contrastive analyst with some kind of measure of degree of difference between compared constructions in language 1 and language 2 also. It has been suggested that deep structure is common to all languages, but languages differ most in their surface structures. Well, about the differences between structuralist and generative grammar, instead of looking for surface structural correspondences, we are looking for correspondences between transformational rules. When a rule of language 1 corresponds with language 2, no contrast results because to be correspondence, it has been claimed that they have to operate on the same base string, involve the same operation, that is deletion, insertion, or just recording elements, and they result in congruent structures of language 1 and language 2. The contrastive analysis is more interested in how the rules differ on their applicability to the structures of two languages. One of the languages tend to apply to the rules, whereas the other does not. For instance, in language 1, the rule could be obligatory, but in language 2, it's optional, or vice versa. For example, concerns the deletion of the article and in Spanish a with coordinated adjectives in English and Spanish. In English, we have the retention of the coordinator that is optional, while in Spanish, it's obligatory. For instance, we can say a young influential singer, that in Spanish could be una cantante joven e influyente. But the thing is that we cannot say something like una cantante joven influyente because it sounds ungrammatical, and we have the feeling that something is missing in this sentence. Well, another advantage of generative grammar approach is that it produces significant generalizations, and this happens when two different areas of the grammar call for the application of one and the same transformation rule. And about the last but not least reason considered here is that some rules imply others. For instance, in the theory, it is mentioned that passivization in English is practically non-existent in German. That implies that this sequence of linguistic events shows clearly how learners tend to transfer transformational potential from language 1 to language 2, but the thing is that they have resultant errors.
Okay, as we consider two models which suggest a pressure by means of which each of the two languages involved in the CA, now we are going to analyze contrastive generative grammar. We can say that the CA will seem to involve two phrases. The first is an independent description and the second is a comparison. However, these two phrases approach is not totally satisfactory because the descriptive phrase seems to be a mere preliminary to CA rather than an integral part of it, and the comparative phrase seems to be determined by input. Okay, we can say that contrastive generative grammar is a procedure whereby the first language and the language 2 are generated from some common base that are compared and contrasted during this process of generation. Okay, K also proposed a vertical CA, and he defines some characteristics. The first is that it's not based on the confluence of two monolingual grammars as the classical CA is, but it's a single bilingual grammar. And it provides an account of the intuitions of an ideal bilingual about the relatedness of his two languages, but The author James does not agree with the idea that psycholinguistic model of a bilingual and a model for CA are one on the same thing. And he pointed that CA is not so much concerned with bilingualism. And James also claims that if by ideal bilingual, as K means, a balanced bilingual, one whose command of the two languages that are equal. And then there will seem to be a little of relevance in such an individual intuitions about the language one and the language two relatedness. He also says that to be a balanced bilingual is to have solved the problems of the language one equal the language two, and to have solved the very problems that CA addressed itself too. In the second characteristic, we can find the derivation from a universal semantic input to language-specific surface structure outputs in 5 stages. We've got the input, semantic, categorical, syntactic, lexical, post-lexicals, and the output. Okay, according to the first stage, we can refer that it consists of configurations of elementary primitive notions such as agent, patient, and all sorts of specification of location in time and space. Okay, here the accent on language is neutrality. No language is excluded because none is included. According to the second stage, we can say that language are categorized the configuration introduced at stage 1 in ways that are characteristic of it, but not necessarily unique to it. So some categories may be universal and others may be shared by language types and some others unique. Then we got the stage number 3. And here the categories are permissible orders in actual sentences. We got function words that are introduced and are called minor lexicalizations. Okay. Then we got the following stage, which is the number 4, and here the language specific, in accordance with language specific possibilities, lexical entries from the dictionary are inserted into the syntactic frames specified at stage 3 and are called major lexicalizations, as for example nouns, adjectives, verbs. And we got the last stage, number 5, and here the transformations are applied, providing outputs with inflections and words boundary markers.
Well, the last theory that we are considering here is case grammar. This theory, it has been proposed that there are two sorts of deep structure in this case. One of them is infrastructure, and the second one is profound structure. Infrastructure underlies the surface structure of a particular language and may be invoked to explain instances of the ambiguity and synonym between pair of sentences in that language. About profound structure, we can say that it is assumed to be universal. The former is more complex and diverse than the latter. Disputative existence is the universal base hypothesis. In the case of infrastructure, the same that we are considering in transformational generative grammar, the theory mentioned before. Well, there are two types of linguistic universals that have been posted by linguistics. One of them is the formal, and the other is the substantive. The formal is considered for all grammars to employ, the transformations cyclically applied. And the substantive is a set of linguistic categories that is noun, verb, phrase, um, subject, and so on. The case grammar is a theory that was developed by Fillmore and consists on a universal semantic base of languages. This theory proposes that the profound deep structure of any sentence in any language must be the form. According to Fillmore, he defines case grammar is a set of universal and concepts which identify certain types of judgments that human beings are capable of making about the events that are going around them, judgments about who did it, who it happened, and what had changed. And case grammar would appear to be a model that is suited to exploration for purposes of contrastive analysis. One of the advantages is its finite universal array of categories that provide us with a common point of departure for any pair of sentences. Uh, we have to compare structurally indeed of pair of sentences of language 1 and language 2 in spite of their specific differences can be traced back to a common single base configuration. Uh, it's a justification for comparing them in the first place. Another advantage that we are considering here is that since the surface structure are derived from deep configurations by transformations, all the advantages of the transformational approach apply equally well. And the last advantage is that the machinery of deep case configurations is so simple and uninvolved that it lends to use a structure. And about the disadvantage, we can say that um, we can say some questions like how many cases it's necessary to posit, or how the cases can be defined, or how can one explain the differences in possibilities of equivalence and that lexical items have in different languages. Well, a solution that is considering in this theory might be to relinquish the claim to universal set of case categories, uh, satisfying himself, which is enough for the two languages under contrast. And that's the last theory that we are considering here.